Hey guys, my name is Shanann. I just want you to know a little bit of my story. I went through one of the darkest times of my life, and then I met Chris. And he's the best thing that has ever happened to me.
How you doing?
How's it going?
There was no note or anything.
I don't know what to do right now.
Shanann Watts believed she had built the life she always wanted. 2 little girls, a baby boy on the way, and a husband who appeared steady beside her in every Facebook post. At the same time, Chris Watts was living a different reality, slipping away from his family, giving his time and attention to another woman. By the morning of August 13th, the clock was already running out. One person was fighting to keep the family together. The other was already planning how to break it apart. But was this just a marriage in trouble, or the quiet setup for something unthinkable? If you were standing in that home, what would you have seen? And whose story would you have believed? This is the story of how one online friend request grew into a marriage, a family, and finally a crime that shocked the world. And it begins with what happened inside that Colorado home. It's after midnight when Shanann Watts walks through the front door of her Colorado home. She's exhausted from travel, but one waits in the dark, silent, his thoughts nowhere near welcome home hugs or small talk. Under the same roof, 2 different battles are playing out. She's fighting for a future. He's drifting toward an escape. But is this just the strain of a troubled marriage? By sunrise, the hours are gone, and choices will be set in stone. If you had been in that house, watching the night unfold, whose truth would you have seen? And whose side would you have chosen? This is where it begins. One family, one night, and a story that forces us to question how well we ever know the people closest to us. It began with a click, a Facebook friend request from Chris Watts to Shanann Watts. And in that moment she said yes, a new chapter opened. But that same connection that brought them together would one day turn to the most tragic incident in the world. It had all happened on the morning of August 13th. What was believed to be a reunion between Chris and Shanann became a choice that was already made, and nothing would ever look the same again. If you had been standing there, whose side would you have believed? Because this story, from a single friend request to a family being spoken about, begins and ends with one haunting truth. Not every love that looks perfect survives the night. Every story has a beginning, though it rarely looks like the start of a tragedy. For Shanann Watts, the beginning wasn't a crime scene or a police interview. It was her life in North Carolina, where she grew up as a determined, hard-working young woman with big dreams. She was never the loudest voice in the room, but she was focused, pushing herself through school and early adulthood with the conviction that she could build a better life. Yet by her 20s, she had already faced struggles most people don't encounter in a lifetime. In her early 20s, Shanann was involved in a serious car accident. The crash shook her to her core. It left her physically scarred, forced her into recovery, and left her questioning whether her life would ever feel stable again. Until then, she had trusted her body, trusted her strength, trusted her ability to carry herself forward. Suddenly, she couldn't. But by her mid-20s, Shanann wanted what so many young women wanted: stability, a partner, and the hope of building a family. She entered into her first marriage with optimism, believing she had found someone who could walk with her through the challenges ahead. For a time, she tried to hold on to that belief. The discovery of her diagnosis of lupus was another blow that shook her both emotionally and physically. But marriage under the weight of lupus was never easy. Doctors' visits, fatigue, and the unpredictability of her illness made everyday life heavy, and her relationship began to suffer. What she needed was a partner who could stand with her, someone who would reassure her that she was more than her diagnosis. But instead, she often felt alone. Arguments came, distance grew, and not long after it had begun, the marriage fell apart. By the late 2000s, Shanann found herself divorced, carrying not only the pain of a broken relationship, but also the fear that her illness had made her too much for anyone to handle. The divorce was a turning point. It broke her confidence, but it also lit a fire in her. If others would not believe in her, she would believe in herself. But instead, she found herself abandoned at one of the lowest points in her life. The end of that marriage left her questioning her worth and her future. She was still young, yet she carried the heaviness of heartbreak, illness, and recovery all at once. And yet, Shanann was not someone who gave up easily. If her life was falling apart, she would find a way to rebuild it. Her tool for rebuilding was Facebook. By the late 2000s, social media had become a stage, a diary, and a lifeline for millions, and for Shanann, it was all three. On her page, she crafted a story of resilience. She posted about gratitude. She shared moments of victory. She smiled in photos, even on days when she felt weak. She wanted the world to see a fighter, a woman who refused to be defined by her scars or her lupus. Facebook became the place where she could be both vulnerable and strong, both hopeful and determined. But behind the polished posts, Shanann still longed for something she couldn't manufacture online: real companionship. Her captions inspired others, but they couldn't replace the quiet of an empty house or the ache of going to bed alone. She wanted someone to stay, someone who wouldn't run from her illness, someone who would see her worth when she doubted it herself. She wanted love that would outlast the hard days. Then, in 2010, Facebook gave her something unexpected. On her screen appeared a suggested friend, Shanann Watts. At first, it was just a name, just a face, one notification among many. Shanann almost ignored it. She later admitted she didn't think much of it at the time. But curiosity won, and she clicked. Chris's profile was nothing like hers. It was quiet, almost bare. He wasn't the type to broadcast his life. He didn't post long updates, didn't share endless photos. He was a reserved man from North Carolina, described by those who knew him as dependable, shy, and steady. In contrast to Shanann's bright and public persona, Chris seemed almost silent. Yet perhaps it was that very stillness that caught her attention. She accepted his request, and that single click connected two very different worlds. Chris began with small gestures, a comment here, a message there. He wasn't dramatic or overwhelming. He was patient, consistent, and present. When Shanann spoke about her lupus, about her struggles, he didn't flinch. He didn't drift away. He stayed. For Shanann, who had already experienced abandonment, that steadiness meant everything. She began to open her heart again. Slowly, she let him into her world. And soon, her Facebook began to tell a new story. In her posts, Chris became the loyal partner she had prayed for, the man who stood beside her when others had left. She praised him openly, writing about his kindness and his support. She posted photos of the two of them smiling, building a picture of a love story that seemed like redemption. But while Shanann shared their story with the world, Chris kept quiet. His page remained sparse. He didn't post tributes or share long declarations. Their relationship lived almost entirely on her timeline, told in her words, shaped by her lens. At first, that difference looked harmless. Shanann was expressive, Chris was reserved. She led, he followed. It looked like balance. But in truth, it was the beginning of an imbalance. One carried the story, while the other stayed a blank page. To outsiders, it seemed perfect. To Shanann, it felt like salvation. But already, beneath the surface, something else was forming. It wasn't visible in the photos. It wasn't written in the captions. It was subtle, silent, hidden. Yet it was there. Because Shanann Watts was not just another man stepping quietly into her life. He would become the man who redefined it, reshaped it, and, eventually, destroyed it. But behind the screens, cracks were already forming in ways no one could see. If you had lived Shanann's life, the car accident that left her scarred, the lupus diagnosis that weakened her body, the divorce that broke her heart, and then saw a man like Chris appear on your screen in 2010, would you have clicked accept? Would you have trusted his silence as safety, or would you have sensed something more? Tell us below, because your answer might reveal more about you than you realize. We also want to appreciate you for your consistent support. This channel grows because of viewers like you. And also you can join our YouTube membership today to unlock exclusive perks, enjoy premium content, and help us keep creating the stories you love. What started as a Facebook suggestion has emotionally grew to a more personal connection. In 2012, Shanann and Shanann Watts stood together and exchanged vows. For Shanann, the moment meant more than just marriage. It was proof that her life, once marked by illness, heartbreak, and divorce, was finally moving forward. She had found a man who seemed dependable, the kind of partner who stayed, and she believed that together they would build the family she had always dreamed of. Chris, as always, was quiet. He didn't speak loudly about his love, didn't shower her with dramatic words, but he stood there, steady, nodding along to the promises they made. To him, marriage was a commitment he was willing to accept. To her, it was the second chance she thought she might never have. Not long after the wedding, the couple put down roots in Frederick, Colorado. They bought a new house, big, spacious, 2 stories, with enough room to grow a family. To neighbors, it looked like the perfect home. Young love, a beautiful house, and the promise of a future together. For Shanann, walking through that door every day was a reminder that she had survived everything life had thrown at her: the car accident, the lupus diagnosis, the failed marriage. Now she had a husband, a home, and the hope of children. That hope turned into reality in December 2013, when their first daughter, Bella, was born. Shanann was overwhelmed with joy. Her Facebook page filled with pictures of Bella wrapped in blankets, her tiny hands clutched in Shanann's. Shanann's captions overflowed with pride. She wanted the world to see that despite everything she had gone through, she was now a mother. But behind the smiles was a woman fighting exhaustion. Pregnancy with lupus had been brutal, and motherhood was even harder. There were days when Shanann could barely get out of bed, yet she forced herself to keep going. Every feeding, every diaper, every sleepless night came with extra weight because of her illness. Still, she never let it show. To Bella, she was just mommy. To her followers, she was radiant. 2 years later, in July 2015, their second daughter, Celeste, lovingly called Cece, was born. Again, Shanann posted glowing pictures of her baby girl, smiling through her pain. She wanted everyone to know how blessed she felt. Now she had 2 daughters, and her family felt complete. Yet the reality inside the house was more complicated. Lupus still hung over her like a shadow. Raising 2 little girls while managing her illness drained her energy, but Shanann refused to let it break her spirit. She was determined to give Bella and Cece a life filled with love, even if it meant pushing herself to the limit. Chris stepped into fatherhood in his quiet way. Neighbors and friends described him as the silent dad. He helped care for the girls, played with them, and was physically present. But emotionally, he seemed detached. He rarely expressed his feelings, rarely posted about his family, rarely said much at all. Shanann carried the emotional weight of their family. She was the voice, the storyteller, the one who made sure the world knew about their milestones. Chris simply stood beside her in photos, smiling softly, leaving Shanann to shape the narrative of their life. In 2016, Shanann found what she thought was her calling: Thrive. The health and lifestyle brand promised energy, wellness, and financial independence. For Shanann, it was more than a job. Thrive gave her purpose, identity, and the chance to build something of her own. She threw herself into it completely, promoting the products, recruiting others, and documenting her Thrive lifestyle online. Her positivity became her brand. She posted daily about her health journey, her children, and her gratitude. She built a following, becoming a leader within the Thrive community. But Thrive was more than business. It was survival. Shanann's illness made her question whether she could keep up with traditional work. Thrive allowed her to work from home, to be with Bella and Cece, and to feel like she was contributing. It gave her confidence at a time when she needed it most. And it gave her a community of women who lifted her up when she felt weak. One of the most important people in that community was Nicole Atkinson. Nicole wasn't just a Thrive teammate. She became Shanann's closest friend, the person she leaned on when she felt overwhelmed. They texted constantly, shared their struggles, and encouraged each other through the ups and downs of motherhood and business. Nicole became part of Shanann's support system, a steady presence who would later prove crucial when Shanann's world unraveled. But at this stage, Nicole was simply her friend, the one who cheered her on, who reminded her she wasn't alone, who kept her going when Chris's silence left her feeling unseen. Because that silence was beginning to matter. Shanann's personality was strong, direct, and ambitious. She wanted to build something lasting, both for her family and for herself. Chris, however, withdrew more and more into himself. He didn't argue, didn't fight, didn't resist her plans. But he didn't engage either. He was passive, nodding along while Shanann shouldered the weight of their life, the finances, the children, the image they projected online. At first, that dynamic looked harmless. To outsiders, it looked like balance. She was the outgoing one, he was the quiet one. But inside the marriage, the gap between them was growing. From the beginning, there had been tension. The first sign had already appeared right from the time of their wedding in 2012. Chris's parents had disapproved of Shanann, and their absence was loud. They had refused to attend the ceremony, a painful rejection that Shanann never forgot. For her, it wasn't just about the wedding. It was about respect, about whether Chris's family would ever truly accept her. That wound lingered in the years that followed. To the world, they looked flawless. Neighbors saw the beautiful home, the smiling little girls, the well-dressed family. Shanann's Facebook told the story of gratitude, positivity, and unshakable love. Friends praised her energy, her devotion, her determination to live fully despite her illness. Chris stood beside her in the photos, quiet, steady, expressionless. To anyone scrolling by, it looked like the perfect marriage. But perfection is often a performance. And in this marriage, the performance was built almost entirely by Shanann. She poured herself into the spotlight, building a brand, shaping a story, refusing to show cracks. Chris stayed in the shadows, silent, withdrawn, his true feelings hidden from everyone, even her. It was the imbalance that no one could see in photos, but that Shanann felt in her heart. She kept pushing forward, determined to make her family's life better. He kept slipping further into silence, a silence that in time would become unbearable. But what happens when one partner lives for the spotlight and the other longs for escape? The outside world saw a couple with a beautiful home, 2 smiling daughters, and a future that looked secure. But behind closed doors, the reality was different. The Watts family was living under a growing shadow of financial trouble. By 2015, they had already filed for bankruptcy once. Their debts piled high, from credit cards to medical bills, to the mortgage on their Frederick home. The house that looked like success from the outside was, in truth, a heavy weight pressing down on them every month. Money became one of the quiet battles in the marriage. Shanann worked tirelessly, pushing her Thrive business, creating the image of financial freedom on social media. Her posts spoke of abundance, gratitude, and a lifestyle of health and success. But the numbers on paper told another story. The couple struggled to keep up. Behind every photo of vacations, cars, or home projects, there was the reality of bills stacked on the counter. Shanann knew how much pressure they were under, but instead of letting the world see, she doubled down. She worked harder, traveled more for Thrive conventions, and poured her energy into making sure their life looked stable, even if it wasn't. Chris, however, seemed less invested in the fight. Friends began to notice the change. At first, he had been quiet but present, steady if not expressive. Over time, he started slipping further into himself. He was there physically, helping with Bella and Cece, showing up for family outings, but emotionally, he felt distant. Shanann's friends like Nicole Atkinson noticed the difference. She saw Shanann fighting to keep the marriage alive, always defending Chris, always insisting things were fine. But she also saw Chris becoming quieter, less engaged, less connected. The financial strain wasn't the only pressure. There were family conflicts too, some that left lasting wounds. Shanann had always had a strong personality. She was outspoken, direct, and protective of her children. Chris, in contrast, was passive, often avoiding conflict even when it mattered. These conflicts stacked on top of the financial stress and the growing emotional distance between them. Shanann worked harder, trying to pull the family forward. She built her image online with Thrive, trying to inspire others and prove to herself that her family could rise above the struggles. But her private messages to Nicole told a different story. She confided in her friend that Chris seemed less affectionate, less present, less like the man she thought she had married. Nicole encouraged her, reminded her she was strong, reminded her she was loved. But even she could see that Shanann's marriage was straining. Chris, meanwhile, said little. To those around him, he appeared calm, steady, unchanged. But his silence spoke volumes. He didn't argue. He didn't fight. He didn't openly resist Shanann. Instead, he withdrew quietly, emotionally detaching in ways that Shanann couldn't always see. To outsiders, the Watts family still looked like a picture of happiness. But inside their home, the emotional distance between husband and wife widened a little more with every passing week. It is often said that a marriage can survive almost anything if both people fight for it. But what happens when only one person keeps fighting? Shanann fought through lupus, through exhaustion, through financial strain, through family conflict, through Chris's passivity. She fought because she believed in the picture she was building, for her daughters, for her marriage, for herself. But as she fought harder, Chris grew quieter. He lived in the same house, but emotionally, he was already slipping out of reach. And just as the marriage strained under pressure, a new presence entered Chris's life. If you were in Shanann's position, working tirelessly to save a marriage while your partner grew more distant, would you keep fighting for the family, or would you have walked away? Tell us in the comments. Your answer may reveal how you see loyalty, silence, and love inside a marriage. Because in the summer of 2018, while Shanann was still fighting to hold her family together, Chris found someone else. A new voice, a new attention, a new escape, and that escape would change everything. By the spring of 2018, Shanann Watts was still fighting for her family. She traveled more to places for Thrive. She posted loving tributes about her husband, and she reminded the world how grateful she was for the life they had built. On Facebook, the picture was clear. Shanann was proud of Chris, proud of her daughters, and confident in the future they were making. But inside Chris, a change had already started. He was losing weight. He was working out more, and he was paying attention to how he looked in ways that Shanann's closest friends noticed, but couldn't yet explain. What they didn't know was that Chris's transformation had a name. Her name was Nicole Kessinger. Nicole Kessinger was a woman with her own ambitions. Intelligent, professional, and independent, she worked in environmental health and safety at Anadarko Petroleum, the same oil and gas company where Chris had worked since 2015. She wasn't a stranger to responsibility. She was focused on her career and, like many, she was searching for companionship. By all accounts, she didn't set out to be anyone's secret. She thought she was meeting a man who was available. When she first crossed paths with Chris at Anadarko, she had no idea of the storm she was about to walk into. Their connection started in the summer of 2018. At work, they began talking, small conversations at first. Chris told Nicole he was at the end of a broken marriage. He said he was living in a loveless home, a man trapped in an unhappy union. He didn't tell her the full truth. He didn't mention Shanann's name, didn't mention Bella and Cece, didn't mention that Shanann was pregnant with their third child. He presented himself as a man who had already checked out, who was just waiting for the paperwork to match the reality he claimed existed. Nicole believed him. She had no reason not to. The thrill of secrecy followed quickly. Their conversations became flirtatious, then intimate. They began seeing each other outside of work, gym dates, quick meals, evenings together when Chris said he was working late. Nicole believed she was building something real, while Chris carefully crafted the illusion that he was free. Soon he bought a second phone, a burner, just for her. He deleted messages. He had calls. And each step deeper into the affair made him bolder, more confident, and more willing to step further away from the life he had built with Shanann. For years, Chris had been described as quiet, reserved, even withdrawn. But now, with Nicole, people saw something different. He started losing weight. He changed his wardrobe. He began grooming differently, carrying himself with a confidence he had never shown before. He was energized, lighter, more alive, at least in Nicole's presence. It was as if he was shedding the quiet, passive husband he had always been and trying on a new role, a man who lived for attention, who felt wanted, who finally had a voice. But this new Chris was built on lies, lies that grew heavier by the day. The contrast between his two lives couldn't have been sharper. On one side, Shanann's Facebook posts painted him as the perfect husband. She bragged about him being a great dad. She praised his support, his loyalty, and his dedication. Even while she was traveling for work, she posted photos of him with Bella and Cece, calling him her rock, telling friends how lucky she was. On the other side, Chris whispered something entirely different into Nicole's ear. He told her he felt trapped. He told her he was living with a woman who controlled him, who made him feel small, who held him in what he described as an abusive marriage. Shanann, who was praising her husband to the world, had no idea that her love was being twisted into complaints behind her back. For Nicole, the relationship felt genuine. She saw a man who wanted a future with her, a man who said he was ready to move on from his past. She believed his words, unaware that his past wasn't past at all. It was still alive, still breathing, still living under the same roof. Chris wasn't just lying to his wife. He was lying to his mistress too. And with every lie, he built a wall between who he was at home and who he was when Nicole was near. This double life became Chris's obsession. He spent more time with Nicole. He traveled with her. He looked up apartments. He imagined what life could be if he left everything behind. Nicole saw him as a man preparing to start over. Shanann saw him as the husband she was still fighting to hold on to. And that tension, invisible to the outside world, was quietly shaping the tragedy that was coming. It raises the question, was Chris truly manipulated by the excitement of the affair, pulled into something he couldn't resist? Or was this who he had always been beneath the surface, a man waiting for the chance to escape the life he had built with Shanann? It's a question that still divides people who study this case. But what cannot be argued is that Chris was living a lie, and with every passing week, that lie grew heavier. By the summer of 2018, Chris Watts was living two lives. In one, he was the father in family photos, the quiet husband in Shanann's glowing posts, the man neighbors believed was stable and reliable. In the other, he was the secret lover, the man whispering about freedom, planning a future with another woman, imagining himself unchained from the responsibilities of his home. Two lives cannot last forever. And for Chris, one of them would have to end. If someone tells you they're trapped in a loveless marriage, do you believe them at face value? Or do you look deeper? Was Chris Watts truly a man seduced into escape? Or was this the real man finally revealing himself? Share your thoughts, because your answer may change the way you see not just Chris, but the people closest to you. Because while Chris was building a secret life with Nicole Kessinger, Shanann was still posting about her love for him, still protecting him, still believing in the marriage she thought they shared. She was pregnant with their third child. She was making plans for the future. And she had no idea that the man she trusted had already begun planning a different ending. The summer of 2018 was supposed to be filled with family time. Shanann wanted her daughters, Bella and Cece, to spend time with their grandparents in North Carolina. She packed up the girls and made the long trip, planning to stay for several weeks. Chris stayed behind in Colorado, continuing his work at Anadarko Petroleum. For Shanann, the trip was both a chance for her girls to bond with family and an opportunity to escape the stress of everyday life. But what should have been a peaceful visit quickly turned into another battle that deepened the cracks in her marriage. The visit to Chris's parents' home in North Carolina reignited long-standing tensions. Shanann had already carried pain from the fact that Chris's parents had refused to attend their wedding years earlier. That wound had never truly healed. Now, with her two daughters in their home, she expected them to show care and respect. Instead, she faced an incident that would later be remembered as Nutgate. Chris's mother, Shanann Watts, had bought ice cream that contained nuts, despite knowing that Cece had a severe nut allergy. To Shanann, this wasn't a small mistake. It was dangerous, and it felt disrespectful. She reacted fiercely, confronting Cindy and cutting the visit short. The argument became a turning point. Shanann felt betrayed, not just by Cindy's actions, but by Chris's silence. Once again, Chris avoided taking a side. He didn't raise his voice, didn't argue with his mother, but he didn't defend Shanann either. For Shanann, that silence was worse than a fight. She wanted her husband to stand beside her, to protect their daughter, to prove his loyalty to the family they had built. Instead, he pulled back, trying to avoid conflict. What he saw as neutrality, Shanann saw as abandonment. The Nutgate conflict widened the distance between Shanann and Chris's parents, and it also widened the distance between husband and wife. Throughout the trip, Shanann continued to confide in her closest friends. She texted Nicole Atkinson regularly, sharing her worries. She told Nicole that Chris seemed distant, colder than he had ever been. She admitted she was afraid of losing him. She told her friends she felt like something was wrong, but she still believed that counseling and effort could fix their marriage. Shanann wasn't ready to give up. She was determined to save the life they had built together, for herself, and especially for Bella and Cece. Her friends could feel her fear through her messages, but they also saw her determination. Shanann was still fighting. What Shanann couldn't see during those weeks in North Carolina was what Chris was doing back in Colorado. While she was dealing with family conflict and worrying about her marriage, Chris was deepening his relationship with Nicole Kessinger. He used Shanann's absence as an opportunity. He spent time with Nicole, went on dates, and even searched online for apartments for the two of them. He wasn't just cheating. He was imagining a life without Shanann, without Bella, without Cece. He was stepping further into a fantasy where he could live as a man unburdened by his past. The secrecy gave him confidence, and with each step, he pulled himself further away from the family waiting for him at home. The contrast between their realities could not have been greater. Shanann posted updates from her trip, sharing pictures of the girls, showing them smiling with cousins and playing with family. She wanted to capture the joy of summer, even in the middle of conflict. She kept telling herself that the marriage could still be saved, that when she returned to Colorado, they would talk, they would try counseling, they would find their way back to each other. Meanwhile, Chris was telling Nicole a different story. He told her he was trapped, told her he was ending the marriage, told her he was ready for a future together. For Nicole, it sounded like love. For Shanann, thousands of miles away, it was betrayal unfolding in silence. As the trip dragged on, Shanann's texts to friends grew heavier. She described Chris as cold and detached. She admitted she was afraid of losing him, afraid he was slipping away in a way she couldn't reach. But she still believed that effort could change the outcome. She was hopeful that when she returned home, they could sit down and fix what was breaking. She wasn't ready to walk away. She was still protecting the picture of their family, still clinging to the hope that Chris could be the man she thought she had married. For Chris, however, the decision had already begun forming in his mind. He had two lives, the one Shanann was fighting to save and the one Nicole believed they were about to start. He couldn't keep both. And while Shanann was away, he moved further toward choosing the new life over the one he had built. He was building lies day by day, lies that would follow him home when Shanann returned. By the end of that summer trip, the distance between husband and wife was no longer just emotional. It was physical, spiritual, and dangerous. Shanann came back to Colorado carrying hope, determination, and the belief that she could still save her marriage. But she returned to a husband who had already given himself to someone else. When Shanann returned, she hoped to mend her marriage. Instead, she was walking into the arms of betrayal. If you were in Shanann's place, watching your partner grow distant, sensing something was wrong, but still believing in counseling and love, would you keep fighting, or would you walk away? Comment below. Your answer may reveal how you view commitment, loyalty, and betrayal. Because when Shanann stepped back into Colorado that August, she carried plans for counseling and rebuilding. But Chris carried something very different. He carried lies, secrets, and a decision that would destroy everything. On August 9th, 2018, Shanann Watts boarded a plane bound for Scottsdale, Arizona. It was a business trip with her Thrive colleagues, one of the many conventions that had become central to her life and her career. She packed her bag, kissed her daughters, and left Chris behind in Colorado. At face value, it was another routine trip, the kind she had taken before. But Shanann carried more than her suitcase that week. She carried doubts, fears, and questions that weighed heavier than anything she could put in her luggage. In the days before her departure, Shanann had tried to reconnect with Chris. She had written him notes, sent him messages, and reminded him of her love. She was pregnant with their third child, a son she had already named Nico. She wanted Chris to share in her excitement, to reassure her that their family was still his priority. But his replies were short, cold, and distant. He didn't match her warmth. He didn't echo her excitement. To Shanann, something felt wrong. She told her friends in text messages, "Something is wrong. He's not himself." While Shanann was in Arizona attending meetings, posing for photos with colleagues, and listening to speeches about positivity and financial freedom, her phone kept buzzing. She kept reaching out to Chris, sending him long, heartfelt messages. She told him she missed him. She told him she loved him. She told him she wanted to fix whatever was broken. The responses that came back were almost mechanical. They lacked emotion, lacked intimacy, and only deepened her worry. Friends who were with her noticed the change in her mood. They saw Shanann, usually full of energy and confidence at these events, turn pensive, distracted by the silence on the other end of her phone. Back in Colorado, Chris was not the husband Shanann imagined him to be while she sent those messages. He was spending time with Nicole Kessinger. He wasn't reflecting on his marriage. He wasn't reading Shanann's words with guilt or love. Instead, he was diving deeper into his double life. During those days, his phone records later showed searches about vacations, about relationship freedom, about what life could be like without the family waiting for him at home. He wasn't planning reconciliation. He was planning an escape. The contrast was heartbreaking. Shanann, in Arizona, was still fighting. She held on to the belief that counseling, effort, and communication could bring her husband back. She reminded her friends that she wasn't giving up, that she believed in marriage, that she believed in Chris. She spoke about wanting to work through the distance she felt, about needing him to show up for her and for the children. In her mind, there was still hope. She was still picturing a future with the man she had promised her life to. But Chris was already gone in every way that mattered. With Nicole, he laughed. He shared plans. He allowed himself to imagine a new life. He searched online about starting over. He enjoyed the attention, the secrecy, the thrill of being someone other than the quiet, passive husband he had always been. In those moments, he wasn't the father of Bella and Cece or the husband of a pregnant wife in Arizona. He was the man Nicole saw, a man free from responsibility, free from the weight of his home life. Shanann could feel the coldness even from hundreds of miles away. In her texts, she pressed him to talk, pressed him to be honest. She wrote words that came from a place of fear and love at the same time. I don't know what's going on with you, but I love you. I want to fix this. His lack of warmth crushed her, but she still clung to hope. She told her friends she believed they could work through it, that she was willing to try anything. For Shanann, giving up was not an option. Those final days in Arizona left Shanann torn between determination and dread. She smiled in photos, stood on stage, and cheered with colleagues. But when she returned to her hotel room, she worried over Chris's silence. She reread her messages. She confided again in Nicole Atkinson and other close friends that something was wrong. She didn't know exactly what it was, but she could feel her marriage slipping through her fingers. She thought counseling could help. She thought communication could heal. She still believed Chris wanted what she wanted, a family that stayed together. What she couldn't see, and what no one in Arizona could have imagined, was that while Shanann was still holding on, Chris was already planning her absence. He was creating a new world in his mind where Shanann and the children didn't exist. The future he whispered about to Nicole was one where his family no longer stood in his way. On the night of August 12th, Shanann boarded her return flight back to Colorado. She texted Chris one more time, telling him she wanted to talk when she got back. She was tired from the trip, but she was ready to work on her marriage. She carried with her hope, love, and determination, even as fear gnawed at her. She believed she could still fix it. She believed she could still bring Chris back. But Chris had already crossed a line she didn't know existed. While Shanann was in the air, he was still in contact with Nicole. He was still living his lie. And when Shanann's plane landed in Colorado just after midnight on August 13th, she stepped off the plane unaware that she had just made the last journey of her life. If your partner stopped showing emotion, stopped responding to love, and pulled away even as you begged to fix the marriage, what would you do? Would you fight harder, like Shanann, or would you walk away? Share your answer. Because the choice you see as obvious may not feel the same when you are the one living it. Because when Shanann walked back into her home in Frederick, she wasn't just returning from a business trip. She was returning to a husband who had already made a decision. The home she believed could be repaired was about to become the scene of betrayal, lies, and death. It was after 1 a.m. on August 13th, 2018, when Shanann Watts stepped off her flight from Arizona and slid into the passenger seat of her friend Nicole Atkinson's car. Nicole had insisted on picking her up after the Thrive business trip, knowing Shanann was tired and stressed. The two women talked during the quiet drive back to Frederick, Colorado. Nicole could tell Shanann was exhausted, but she also carried something heavier: worry about her marriage, fear about Chris's distance, the weight of her pregnancy. Nicole dropped her at the Watts home just before 2 a.m. Shanann walked up the driveway, suitcase in hand, the porch light flickering dimly above her. That was the last time anyone outside that house saw her alive. The same morning, Shanann had a doctor's appointment. She was almost 15 weeks pregnant, and it was supposed to be a routine checkup for her and baby Nico. But the hours passed, and Shanann never showed up. Calls from her doctor went unanswered. Messages from Nicole went unanswered too. At first, Nicole tried to reassure herself. Maybe Shanann had overslept after the late flight. Maybe she was busy with Bella and Cece. But as the morning stretched into afternoon, her worry grew sharper. This wasn't like Shanann. She was responsible. She kept her appointments, and she never ignored her phone. Nicole felt it in her gut. Something was wrong. By midday, Nicole couldn't shake the feeling. She drove to the Watts home, determined to check on her friend. When she pulled into the driveway, the house looked quiet, too quiet. Shanann's car was there, but something about the silence unsettled her. Nicole knocked on the door. No answer. She tried calling again. Still no answer. Nicole's worry turned into panic. She called Chris, telling him she was at the house and couldn't reach Shanann. He answered calmly, saying he didn't know where Shanann or the girls were. But his calmness didn't match the urgency Nicole felt. She expected panic, fear, a husband rushing home to check on his pregnant wife and children. Instead, Chris sounded detached. Nicole, overwhelmed with dread, made a decision that changed everything. She picked up the phone and dialed 911. The call was clear, firm, and full of fear. Nicole told the dispatcher that her friend was pregnant, had missed an appointment, and that her car was still at the house. She explained that Shanann's girls, Bella and Cece, were also unaccounted for. The dispatcher promised to send officers. Nicole stayed on the scene, pacing outside the house, waiting for help. Neighbors began to gather, sensing something wasn't right. The quiet street in Frederick was about to become the center of a mystery that would grip the entire country. When police arrived, Chris finally showed up. He walked calmly toward the house, carrying himself like nothing was wrong. To the officers, to the neighbors, to Nicole, it felt odd. Most husbands at that moment would be frantic, demanding answers, begging for help. Chris was almost too composed. He told officers he had no idea where Shanann or the girls were. He suggested maybe Shanann had taken the children to a friend's house. He shrugged, as if the thought of his pregnant wife vanishing was just another inconvenience in his day. But the signs inside the house told another story. The police noticed the purse. They noticed the phone. They noticed the medications. They noticed the car still sitting in the garage. If Shanann had left, why would she have left everything behind? Why would she abandon the essentials of her life? Her wallet, her lifeline, her medicine, without a word. Nothing made sense. Nicole pressed Chris, asking him why Shanann wasn't answering, why her belongings were still there. She demanded answers, her voice shaking with anger and fear. Chris gave the same calm replies, repeating that he didn't know, that maybe she had gone somewhere. But the longer he spoke, the more his words felt hollow. The police, the neighbors, and Nicole could all sense it. Something was terribly wrong inside that house. That day, August 13th, was supposed to be ordinary. Shanann had a doctor's appointment. Bella and Cece were supposed to play in their rooms, laugh in the yard, live the lives of little girls with their whole futures ahead. Instead, silence filled the home. And as investigators took their first steps inside, they noticed what everyone else was feeling. The story Chris was telling did not match the evidence in front of them. But as investigators entered the Watts home, something didn't add up. Because inside the Watts home, as officers began piecing together the first clues, Chris stood calmly in front of them, insisting he didn't know where his wife and children had gone. But behind his calm mask, cracks were beginning to show, cracks that would expose a horrifying truth. On the morning of August 14th, 2018, just a day after Shanann and the girls were reported missing, Chris Watts stepped out into the bright Colorado sun and faced the television cameras. The scene was surreal, a quiet suburban street lined with police cars, neighbors whispering on their lawns, and Chris standing in his driveway, the very place his daughters had once played with chalk, speaking to reporters about his missing family. His words were the ones people expected to hear. He said he wanted them home. He said he had no idea where they were. He said he needed them safe. But what chilled those listening wasn't what he said, it was how he said it. His voice was flat, his face dry, his tone without the urgency of a husband and father whose family had just vanished. To anyone watching, something felt wrong. Shanann was 15 weeks pregnant. Bella was 4. Cece was 3. They hadn't been seen in more than a day, and every second mattered. Any other father might have been shouting their names, begging for their return, holding up photos with shaking hands. Chris stood calmly, arms crossed, rocking back and forth on his feet, as though he were rehearsing lines. The driveway that should have been a place of heartbreak had become a stage, and his performance rang hollow. People watching at home leaned closer to their screens. Neighbors standing nearby shared uneasy looks. It didn't feel like grief. It felt like something else. The body cam footage from the officers inside the Watts home made the unease even sharper. When police arrived, they expected to see a frantic husband pacing the floors, pulling open closets, calling Shanann's name. Instead, they found Chris oddly detached. He pointed out items casually, as if giving a tour. He offered explanations that didn't fit, like suggesting Shanann had taken the kids to a friend's house, while her car still sat silent in the garage. Her purse was on the counter. Her medications were untouched. Her phone was left behind, something Shanann would never do. Yet Chris barely reacted. He nodded, shrugged, and stayed composed. Officers felt the same thing Nicole Atkinson had felt the day before. His calmness didn't match the situation. For neighbors, watching Chris was unsettling in a way that is hard to explain. These were people who had seen him in the yard, quiet but present, playing with Bella and Cece. They knew the sound of the girls' laughter. They knew the rhythms of the house. Now, as Chris stood stiff in front of cameras, they saw none of the desperation they expected. One neighbor told the police bluntly, "He's not acting right." Parents especially felt it in their bones. They knew what it was to lose track of a child even for a minute in a grocery store. The panic, the racing heart, the desperate search. Yet here was Chris, a man whose entire family was gone, and he seemed more concerned about appearances than about action. For Shanann's best friend Nicole Atkinson, the scene was unbearable. She had dropped Shanann off at this very house just hours before Shanann was killed. She had called the police, she had sounded the alarm, and now she stood there watching Chris on television, speaking to the world like nothing had happened. Nicole knew Shanann. She knew her friend's routines, her devotion to her kids, her constant attachment to her phone. Seeing Chris stand there without tears, without urgency, twisted her stomach. She told police immediately. Something was wrong, and she didn't believe a word he was saying. Investigators were coming to the same conclusion. Chris's story had holes. He repeated that Shanann must have left with the kids. But if she had, why leave her phone? Why leave her car? Why leave her medication? These weren't things you could forget. These were the anchors of Shanann's life, and they were all still in the house. Every word Chris spoke only deepened the doubt. Instead of clearing suspicion, his calm answers and lack of urgency pulled the spotlight tighter on him. Then came the television interviews that spread across the country. Millions of viewers watched Chris stand in front of the cameras, rocking back and forth, arms crossed, eyes darting. He didn't call Shanann by name with love in his voice. He didn't beg whoever had them to bring them back. He didn't cry. He looked, instead, like a man performing. The world noticed. On social media, strangers asked the same question. Why doesn't he look more worried? Why isn't he crying? Why does he look like he's reading from a script? Chris had hoped the interviews would make him look like a grieving husband. Instead, they made him look like a man hiding something. For the police, every second of his behavior mattered. Detectives are trained to read people, to compare actions with circumstances. They had seen husbands in despair, parents in agony. Chris wasn't that. He was too flat, too detached, too careful. And once again, his words didn't match the reality inside the house. His wife was pregnant. His daughters were little girls. None of them had been seen for more than a day. And he was standing calmly, as though waiting for the cameras to leave. The mask Chris had worn for years, the quiet, dependable husband, was beginning to slip in front of the world. His neighbors could feel it. Nicole Atkinson could feel it. The investigators could feel it. Everyone who watched him knew something didn't add up. The problem was proving it. And then, a single video clip from a neighbor's security camera cracked the facade wide open. If you were standing in that driveway, watching Chris speak about his missing wife and children without a single tear, what would your heart tell you? Would you take his words at face value, or would you feel, like his neighbors did, that something was terribly wrong? Because when investigators stepped into that neighbor's living room and looked at his security camera footage, they saw something that Chris had not planned for. And in that moment, the calm mask he had worn so carefully began to crumble. When police first brought Chris Watts into the interrogation room, they already had doubts. His calmness, his flat words, and the inconsistencies in his story had set off alarms. But it was the neighbor's security camera that shifted the case. The video showed Chris early in the morning of August 13th, backing his truck into the garage. He explained it away, claiming he was loading tools for work. But investigators knew something about his tone, about his body language when the footage played, wasn't right. He grew nervous, avoided eye contact, rubbed his face, shifted in his seat. It was the first real crack in the wall he had built. Detectives began pressing him with questions. Where exactly had Shanann gone? Why had she left her phone, her purse, her car? Why had he said they'd had an emotional conversation, but given no details? His answers circled back again and again. He didn't know. He guessed. Maybe. He tried to look calm, but his stories didn't match the facts. The lies sounded thinner every time he repeated them. The turning point came when investigators suggested a polygraph test. Chris, confident he could maintain his image, agreed. It was a gamble. He sat down, hooked up to the wires, asked direct questions about whether he had hurt Shanann or the children. The results were immediate. Chris Watts failed. The polygraph examiner looked him in the eye and told him plainly, "There's no way you didn't know what happened. You failed the test." For the first time, his composure began to slip. Detectives used psychological techniques, leaning on him with both firmness and false comfort. They told him it was time to stop pretending. They told him they could understand if something had happened in the heat of the moment. They pushed him to unburden himself, to tell the truth, even if only part of it. Slowly, Chris began to shift. He dropped his head into his hands. He breathed heavier. And then, finally, words slipped out. But the words weren't what investigators expected. Chris didn't confess to killing his family outright. Instead, he framed Shanann. He said she had been the aggressor, that she had hurt their daughters, and that he had killed her in rage after finding out. It was a twisted story, designed to paint him as a grieving father who had snapped in the moment. But even in that lie, Chris admitted what he had done. He had killed Shanann. It was the first piece of the truth to emerge, though far from the whole. The real truth, when it finally came out, was far worse than his twisted confession. In the early hours of August 13th, just hours after Nicole Atkinson had dropped Shanann home, Chris confronted his pregnant wife in their bedroom. He straddled her on the bed, pressed his hands around her throat, and strangled her until she was gone. All while Bella and Cece were still in the house. Bella, just 4 years old, knew something was wrong. Cece, only 3, was awake too. The children Chris was supposed to protect had been just a few feet away as he ended their mother's life. When Shanann was dead, Chris didn't stop. He wrapped her body in a sheet, dragged her down the stairs, and placed her in his truck. Bella and Cece were there, alive, watching. Their innocence couldn't shield them from what their father was about to do. He drove them all, his wife's body and his living daughters, to a remote oil site owned by his company. There, the horror deepened. At the site, Chris killed his daughters one by one. He smothered Celeste first, pressing a blanket over her face until she stopped breathing. Bella, old enough to understand, fought back. Reports later revealed that she pleaded with her father, asking why he was doing this, and that her final word was simply, "Daddy." Chris smothered her too, ignoring the voice of the little girl who trusted him most. When it was over, Chris disposed of their bodies with methodical cruelty. He buried Shanann in a shallow grave near the oil site, the same ground where she had once dreamed of raising her son Nico. He then carried his daughters to 2 large oil tanks. He forced their small bodies inside separate hatches, leaving them in the dark, industrial tombs where he thought no one would find them. The image was almost unbearable. 2 little girls, hidden in tanks meant for crude oil, put there by the man they called their father. The forensic evidence that followed painted the picture in chilling detail. Cell phone data traced Chris's movements from the house to the oil site. GPS records from his work truck matched the timeline exactly. Autopsy reports confirmed the causes of death: strangulation for Shanann, smothering for Bella and Cece. The physical evidence, combined with his own shifting confessions, proved what he had tried to deny. There was no abusive wife. There was no sudden rage. There was only premeditated betrayal and murder. The raw brutality of the crime shocked even seasoned investigators. This wasn't a stranger, a break-in, or an accident. It was betrayal at its core. A mother strangled by the husband she loved. 2 daughters smothered by the father they trusted. A family wiped out by the man who was supposed to protect them. It was the destruction of everything Shanann had fought to build: her home, her family, her hope for the future. And it all ended in the back of a truck in the soil of an oil field. Chris Watts thought he could hide the truth. He thought he could bury it, cover it, and move on with his new life. But the truth has a way of surfacing. And once investigators pieced together the evidence, there was no running from it. But when the courtroom doors opened, the world would finally confront the depth of Chris Watts' lies. When Chris finally admitted to killing Shanann, but tried to blame her for harming the girls, how would you have reacted as an investigator? Would you have believed any part of his story, or would his calm lies only have pushed you to dig harder? Because the murders were not the end of the story. The world still had to hear the case laid bare in a courtroom. The prosecutors would reveal every detail, the lies, the planning, the brutality, and Chris. When the truth of Chris Watts' crimes became undeniable, the case did not head toward a lengthy trial. In November 2018, only 3 months after Shanann, Bella, and Cece were laid to rest, Chris appeared in court and accepted a plea deal. He pleaded guilty to 5 counts of first-degree murder. Shanann, Bella, Cece, and the unborn son Shanann had named Nico. He also admitted to tampering with their bodies and to unlawfully terminating a pregnancy. In exchange for his guilty plea, prosecutors agreed not to pursue the death penalty. Instead, Chris received 5 life sentences without the possibility of parole. He would spend the rest of his life behind bars, locked away, never again to walk free. The sentencing hearing was raw with emotion. Shanann's parents, Frank and Sandra Razusek, sat in the courtroom and faced the man who had destroyed their family. They gave victim impact statements that left the room in tears. Sandra, her voice breaking, spoke directly to Chris, telling him that her daughter and granddaughters had loved him unconditionally, even when he didn't deserve it. Frank said that the loss had left a hole in their lives that could never be filled. They told the judge and the world about Shanann's strength, Bella's sweetness, Cece's energy, and the unborn baby Nico who would never have a chance to live. Their words weren't just grief. They were also love, love for the family they had lost, love that Chris could never erase, no matter what he had done. The community that had once admired the Watts family's picture-perfect image now gathered in sorrow and outrage. Vigils were held, candles lit, prayers said. Neighbors who had watched the girls ride bikes and play in the yard stood together, unable to believe what had happened in the house across the street. Parents held their own children tighter, shaken by the thought that the danger hadn't come from a stranger, but from inside a family's own walls. The betrayal cut deep because it defied the natural bond of parent and child, husband and wife. The man they thought was quiet and dependable had been hiding darkness they could not imagine. As for Nicole Kessinger, the woman Chris had built his secret life around, her name quickly disappeared from public life. Once her identity was revealed, she faced scrutiny, suspicion, and relentless public attention. She told investigators she had no idea Chris's wife was pregnant or that he intended violence. Still, her face became part of the story. Her connection to Chris was dissected, debated, and judged. After her cooperation with police, she vanished from view, leaving behind the same unanswered questions that lingered about her role. Did she truly not know the extent of his deception, or had she simply chosen to believe his lies? To this day, her silence adds another layer to the mystery of how this tragedy unfolded. The fascination with the Watts case has never faded. Books, documentaries, podcasts, and endless debates continue to revisit every detail. People study Chris's television interviews, trying to understand his body language. Others pore over Shanann's social media posts, seeing the love and devotion she shared so openly and wondering how those images could exist alongside such betrayal. The story is retold again and again, not just because of its brutality, but because of the unsettling questions it raises about trust, deception, and the fragility of relationships. How could a man who tucked his daughters into bed, who posed for smiling photos with his wife, commit the ultimate act of betrayal against them? In the end, the Watts family murder isn't only about death. It is about betrayal in its most personal form. Shanann believed in Chris until the end. She defended him to her friends, even as she sensed something was wrong. Bella and Cece trusted their father with the innocence only children can have. Nico would never know the world outside his mother's womb. And all of them were taken by the very man who was supposed to protect them. That is the weight that lingers in this story. The weight of love met with betrayal, trust answered with destruction. The case forces us to reflect on how little we may truly know about the people closest to us. Shanann had shared her life publicly, opening the world to her family through her posts. She believed she was showing the picture of happiness. But inside her own home, a secret was growing, a double life unfolding that she could not see. The Watts family murder began with a simple online connection, a Facebook friend request that seemed like the start of a love story. And it ended with silence in a home once filled with laughter. It leaves us with a haunting question. How well do we ever truly know the ones we love? If this story gripped you the way it has gripped the world, share your thoughts in the comments. Do you believe there were signs no one noticed? Or was Chris Watts hiding behind a mask too carefully crafted to see through? Like this video, share it to keep Shanann, Bella, Cece, and Nico's memory alive, and subscribe so you don't miss the next story we uncover.